So I thought I'd make a brief summary of modern jazz video to conclude this playlist, just to give you a broad overview of modern jazz and espouse the general idea behind or underlying modern jazz. Now you'll have to excuse me a bit, as I will have to get a little bit more philosophical in this lesson. Now, in a way, modern jazz can be characterized as the decline and fall of the chord, or a war on chords, with the ultimate goal being freer improvisation. So swing jazz is tonal, and in the 1940s, jazz musicians took swing music and made it faster and more harmonically complex and created bebop, but it was still tonal. By this I mean that it had functional chords generally built up in thirds, where the dominant chord feels like it wants to resolve down a fifth to the tonic. So a G7 pulls towards a C major 7. So because of this 5-1 pull, the typical tonal chord progression moves through the cycle of fifths, like a E moving down to an A, moving down to D, moving down to G, moving down to a C. And the goal of the soloist was simply to restate the chord changes by targeting guide tones and avoiding avoid notes. But this is naturally very restricting to your improvisation. So by the 1950s, there was a reaction to this really fast and dense and complex bebop music with the creation of modal jazz, which has very few chords and was much slower. Now this used non-functional chords, generally built up in fourths, to avoid any sense of tonality. And the typical modal chord movement or chord progression is movements by step. Now the goal of the soloist here was to create interesting melodies within the mode, emphasizing the character tone. Now this is much less constricting than tonal improvisation, but there are still some constraints and restrictions, like the fact that you have to stick to a particular mode. So then by the late 1950s and 1960s, this trend was pushed even further with the creation of free jazz. Now this often used no chords whatsoever. And because of this, there is no restriction to your improvisation, because there's no strict underlying harmony which you have to adhere to. So you could play atonally, that is without a key and without a tonal center, or more often in free jazz, you could play pantonally, that is you could play in any key with any note being the tonal center. This is because jazz music is heavily rooted in folk music, especially the blues, which itself is strongly rooted in tonality. So jazz can't really completely disregard its history and move to complete atonality like classical music did. So while chords are generally used to imply tonality, you can also use scales without chords to imply tonality by playing arpeggios. So you can still play tonally without chords, and this is perfectly fine and allowed in free jazz. Now another way to express this is that there are two ways of thinking about improvisation. There's vertical thinking, that is in terms of chords or vertical structures. You can still play chromatic notes, but you're thinking about them in terms of chords and chord degrees. So in terms of a flat 9 or a sharp 9 or 11 or a sharp 11. And then there's horizontal thinking, that is thinking in terms of scales and melodies. Now here too you can play chromatic notes, but you're thinking about them in terms of scales and scale degrees. And so a vertical solo and a horizontal solo can sound exactly the same, it's just a different way of thinking about the solo. And modern jazz can generally be categorized as the moving away from vertical and towards horizontal thinking. Now in this new modern jazz, all things are relative. There are no rules, there are no more right and wrongs. There are only notes and intervals. And if you use a tonal center, then you have a reference point for your relativity. So there's still no right and wrong chord or right and wrong note. There are only chords and notes that are closer or further away from this tonal center, and as such create different levels of tension. So chords aren't right or wrong, but rather they have a relationship based on the distance from the tonal center. But the tonal center can also be quite subjective. Two people can listen to the same song and disagree about what the tonal center is, and even if there was a tonal center. Now, I mentioned this in my video on free jazz, but it's worth saying again. Atonalism and pantonalism is dangerous because it allows anyone with a piano or with an instrument to play jazz. If you don't need to follow rules and you can sound intentionally bad, then how do we differentiate between an experienced free jazz musician and a cat walking across a piano? Now, unfortunately, there's no objective, tangible answer to this. But the subjective, abstract answer is that free jazz musicians play with conviction and feeling. If you play with conviction, like you know what you're doing, like this is truly how you feel, if you play confidently and emotionally, then it will be good jazz. But if you just play random notes willy-nilly, then it will be bad jazz. And also, like with everything else, you need to know the rules in order to break them. Now, I also wanted to say a final word on contemporary jazz. Now, whenever something new is created, it's generally taken to the logical extreme, and then there's a reaction against it, and finally, both things are accepted and absorbed into the mainstream. Now, this is a philosophical concept called the Hegelian dialectic, which posits that there's a thesis which breeds its own antithesis and finally combines into a synthesis, and then the process repeats itself. So bebop took swing and pushed it to the extreme by making it really fast and really harmonically complex. Then there was a reaction against bebop with the creation of modal jazz and free jazz, which themselves were pushed to the extreme by having whole songs written with either one chord or even no chords. And now all three genres are generally accepted and mixed and matched together in contemporary jazz. So then once you get over the novelty of a new genre, the way you truly progress and evolve through music is by absorbing various factors and techniques and using them as but one color on your palette. So while it may be fun and challenging to create a completely atonal song start to finish, you may also find songs that use a combination. So you may find songs that start tonal, then move into modality, then come back to tonality, then move into atonality, then you could have a period of silence, and then they go back and finish in tonality. Cool, and that's all I really wanted to cover in this concluding video on modern jazz. Thanks a lot for watching as always, and feel free to leave any questions or comments. See ya!